Good morning. I'm Jennifer Carr, Deputy Administrator for the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection. My responsibilities at NDEP include Nevada's water quality programs, encompassing the Bureaus of Water Quality Planning and Water Pollution Control, among others. This morning, I'll provide an overview of the definitions of waters of the state, waters of the United States, federal rule changes that occurred in 2020, and how NDEP is reacting to those changes. Nevada has been protecting the quality of all waters of the state under the Nevada Water Pollution Control Law since 1973. Nevada's Water Pollution Control Law extends water quality protections to all waters of the state, including both surface water and groundwater. Nevada regulations protect the beneficial uses of all waters in Nevada and prohibit the discharge of a pollutant without a permit. As you can see from the definition of waters of the state, it is incredibly inclusive of all of our water resources, surface and underground, natural and artificial. I only have 10 minutes, so the nutshell version of the definition of waters of the United States that are subject to federal jurisdiction in Nevada is summarized here. The 2015 codification never took effect in Nevada due to our participation in the North Dakota case and the stay of federal implementation that court case provided. Now, as of June, the latest federal definition is in effect. It's titled the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, but I often still use the term WOTUS for waters of the United States. This Venn diagram generally depicts the scope of jurisdictional waters. One of the primary differences between state and federal jurisdiction is whether discharges to groundwater are regulated. Groundwater is generally excluded from federal rules, except in the 2015 rule where surface waters with a subsurface hydrologic connection through groundwater to federal jurisdictional waters were included in the definition. This was one of the primary reasons why NDEP joined suit against the 2015 definition. The 2020 Navigable Water Protection Rule specifically excludes groundwater, and surface waters must have a surface connection for federal jurisdiction to apply. This potentially affects federal oversight of wetlands. Another major difference is that the 2020 rule also excluded waters that are ephemeral in a typical year because they only flow in response to a storm event, which is primarily why the green oval shrunk in 2020. Federal requirements only apply to waters determined by the U.S. EPA or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to be waters of the U.S. I pulled out the tribal waters because NDEP does not assert jurisdiction on tribal lands. Tribal waters are regulated by the tribe itself with federal oversight or by U.S. EPA directly. Regardless of federal jurisdiction overlay, which could change again, NDEP still regulates water quality protection for all waters of the state. In really broad terms, we look for an indicator of what the definitional changes might do for Nevada's programs. Looking at about 12 years of data for 401 state certifications that NDEP issued for Army Corps 404 permit actions, we found these statistics. As you can see here, nearly 60% of projects are likely to remain under federal jurisdiction with no change at all. Only 4% of our projects involve wetlands and springs. While these are small in number, they will be complicated for NDEP to permit and will take the most time if they're solely under state jurisdiction. 7% were for wash projects, which may or may not stay under federal jurisdiction due to their inherently ephemeral nature. But if a storm could carry fill material into a WOTUS, the Corps may choose to retain jurisdiction. The 23% that were identified as ephemeral waters are likely out, but still under NDEP permitting in the Bureau of Water Pollution Control. For the scope of this discussion, it is important for you to understand the jurisdictional status of various waterways in Nevada. This information was obtained through FOIA of Army Corps records. Section 10 waters were defined in 1899 by the Rivers and Harbors Act, and Nevada has two listed there. The Nevada Supreme Court declared the Carson River a navigable water in a court case in 1972. And issued opinions that the Carson River is a navigable stream due to the river being used to float logs during the Comstock era. Amusingly, a 1972 letter from Attorney General Robert List to an official at the Army Corps of Engineers in Sacramento said, "The invitation to raft the Carson River remains open. My wife and I walked across the river last year and the tops of our toes did not get wet." The Truckee River is a traditionally navigable water for similar reasons, including floating timber for railroad construction. But it's also documented as an important factor in interstate commerce. Historic documents note that Wadsworth was an important rail center, particularly for the shipment of Pyramid Lake cutthroat trout to San Francisco markets. In 1888 alone, 250,000 pounds of trout were shipped from Wadsworth. The Snake River in Idaho is a Section 10 water and as a tributary to the Snake, the Bruno River is federally jurisdictional, with discussion of navigation for recreation on the Bruno itself. In 1973, the federal government declined jurisdiction of the Humboldt River, but in 2009, Rye Patch Reservoir was deemed jurisdictional due to interstate commerce. Now the river system upstream and tributary to Rye Patch is jurisdictional, but downstream of the dam, it is presumably not. Lake Las Vegas was added in 2008 due to its navigable nature, because you can rent boats, and the interstate commerce it creates through tourism. Project jurisdictional determinations expire after 5 years, but their documentation gives us a basis on how they were evaluated at that time. Key takeaway here is that it's possible that not much will actually change because most of Nevada's major river systems are represented, with one significant exception that you might have noticed. Understanding what is in and out is only somewhat definable at this time. Waters are subject to review and reinterpretation. Some prior JDs assert jurisdiction based on ephemeral connections to perennial waters, which are likely not going to be the case. The biggest change to our jurisdictional waters is the Walker River system. The Army Corps has no historic records designating it as a traditionally navigable water, and removal of state lines from the definition, we understand, removed it from federal jurisdiction. As far as we know, it is now solely a state water. The Amargosa River also became a state water due to the state line definitional change, and others along all 4 boundaries would be similar. While it has not been tested yet, an example of an ephemeral break severing jurisdiction may be the Reese River. If it is determined that it does not flow to the Humboldt in a typical year, when the upper portion of the Reese will no longer be jurisdictional, it will solely be a state water. Typical year is a new concept in the 2020 rule. Key takeaway here: please discuss your project with the Army Corps and NDEP early and don't make any assumptions. The Attorney General's office has confirmed that NDEP does not need any additional statutes or regulations to create or modify permits needed to bridge the gap for protection of waters that, quote unquote, fall out of federal permitting authorities. For wetlands, NDEP can limit impacts or authorize activities with mitigation measures using existing permitting authority. Again, the Nevada Attorney General's office confirmed that NDEP has the authority to prevent unpermitted discharge of fill material to a wetland under our water pollution control law. Of course, discharge of a pollutant without a permit is prohibited. And among other things, dredged soil, rock, and sand, wrecked or discarded equipment, or fill material, are defined pollutants in Nevada law. One area where we do lack authority is in that Nevada cannot establish a mitigation banking system. At this time, NDEP anticipates that project proponents will have to be creative in designing their mitigation strategies so that we can include them as permit requirements. It's critical to engage NDEP early to discuss potential mitigation projects and how they may be incorporated into permits. This type of permit will be complex and it could take over 6 months. Early planning is essential. Here, I would like to also implore you for ideas that you might have where we could use some help. If you have a project or land that might make a good mitigation project for another project that's going on, or if there are a couple of developers want to work together to create mutually beneficial outcomes by having one be mitigating for another, we'd really like to have some ideas on what this might entail. In addition, we'd really like to hear what thoughts you might have on ways we could build a knowledge base for these sorts of projects and ideas and how to track them. So what now? Well, NDEP is actively developing several permit products to fill the gap left by the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. Historically, Nevada has relied upon Army Corps 404 permits for dredge and fill activity related to wetlands, and NDEP will develop similar permits. For stream work generally, Army Corps and NDEP have worked together, limiting overlapping permits. Using the Working in Waterways permit, NDEP will develop a hybrid for state-only waters. Additional permits include construction stormwater permits for several types, and permit products are expected generally to have a general permit version for simpler projects with minimal impacts and individual permit versions for more complex projects. So let's work through a couple of examples. So if you have a wetland that has a hydrologic surface connection in a typical year with a jurisdictional waterway, The Army Corps still asserts jurisdiction, or is expected to, and no change in permitting, 404 or 401 certification, or NDEP's existing permitting practices would change. That'll all be the same. Now, in another example, if Army Corps staff determined that an upland wetland does not have a hydrologic surface connection with a jurisdictional waterway in a typical year, then NDEP jurisdiction is anticipated, but discharge permits are still required. Please note that it's really important to ensure that you talk to the Army Corps because they actually have to decline jurisdiction in order to determine NDEP's role. If your project is in the Walker River Basin, NDEP jurisdiction is expected. Of course, it's best practice to continue to check with the Army Corps of Engineers, even in the case of the Walker River, because we don't know when or if this might change in the future. If your project has a component impacting a wetland, but it really doesn't look like it's connected to a jurisdictional water, it's still probably complicated. So again, talk to the Army Corps of Engineers. They have to determine what happens to that flow regime in a typical year and if there's a hydrologic connection that might not be obvious, or if there's a potential to impact a jurisdictional water. The main key takeaway that I really like to have everyone settle in on is the fact that if Army Corps of Engineers declines jurisdiction, it does not mean that permitting is not required. We've heard this mentioned out and about, and it really gives us cause for concern. So please engage early with an NDEP Bureau of Water Pollution Control supervisor to begin an exchange of information about your project. Conference coordinators asked us to come up with a few things that we'd like to see in the coming months or years, so this is my wish list. I hope that interested stakeholders will self-identify and engage with NDEP on upcoming permit development projects. My second wish is for ideas on project mitigations to emerge, as well as a method of identifying them for future project permitting. Finally, NDEP, US EPA, and the Army Corps of Engineers will be partnering on GIS efforts to more clearly depict what we know about federal jurisdiction. This is already somewhat in the works, but it really needs to gather some momentum. Thank you very much for attending this presentation and the entire panel. Next, please click into the live Q&A session with all the panel members. We'll see you there.